Today, Zero announced a brand new electric adventure motorcycle called the DSR X, and I was lucky enough to go out to Sicily last week to ride it. But does an electric adventure motorcycle really make sense? Well, in this video, we'll find out. So what have we got here? Well, effectively, they've taken the same platform as their SRF naked bike and the SRS Tourer, and then they've simply applied the classic adventure motorcycle formula. So whilst the 17.3 kilowatt hour battery is the same, the motor's broadly the same as well, and the software that manages it all, there's a new frame wrapped around it and a new swing arm, both of which have been reinforced to take more impact and load. The suspension, although similar in spec to the other bikes, is slightly longer, lifting the bike for better off-road clearance. There's a 19-inch wheel at the front, so again, better rolling off-road. And you've got the option to spec it with some tubeless spoked wheels and some Pirelli Scorpion Rally STR handbook-approved tyres. There's a more upright riding position with wide bars, plenty of wind protection with the handguards and an adjustable windscreen. And then, of course, in the accessories catalogue, you've got all the usual fare, so crash bars, peripheral lights, a touring screen, and full 3-piece metal luggage. So it looks the part on paper, and in fact I'd say it looks pretty good in the flesh too. When they whipped the covers off at the press briefing on the first night, I was actually super impressed. I mean, it's definitely a Zero. The flat horizontal lines across the top there appear on their other models. Those headlights have plenty in common with the SRS, and then of course the battery and trellis frame are instantly recognizable from the S and the SRF, but it's just like they've mixed it with a dose of multi-strata, especially in that white finish with the road bias cast wheels and the Pirelli Scorpion Trail 2 tyres. But stick that spoked wheel set on and the semi-knobbly tyres and it looks even better in my opinion, a little bit more aggressive and purposeful. And so I think it's fair to say that all round they've done a great job of the styling here. Some of the older Zeros like the DSR always looked a little off to me, the proportions weren't quite right, but this bike, it really is neatly done, and regardless of whether it's an electric or not, I'd say it's up there with the best looking new bikes this year. Out on the road, you get all the benefits of that massively torquey electric motor. It genuinely does feel like a quick bike, and there are 5 riding modes to choose from. So Eco, Rain, Standard, Sport, and Canyon. I find myself using Canyon to get that super lively throttle response, but even in that mode, the electronics just find this really nice balance of sort of eking the power out in a really approachable way. And yet at the same time, there's a massive shove of torque when you get on it out of the corners. Now it does die off a little bit when you get it up to the top end at sort of motorway speeds and beyond, but in the sort of range where you're doing most of your cornering at road speeds, it is super punchy and lots of fun to ride. Plus you've got that electric whining soundtrack, which I know it's not perhaps quite as nice to listen to as something like a Multistrada V4 perhaps, but I still like it in this sort of futuristic kind of way. Now it is worth adding that peak torque is actually up on the SRF and SRS. Owing to some tweaks to the motor, it's not a completely new unit, but it's basically been retuned and now makes 225 Newton meters of peak torque as opposed to the 190 of the other bikes. So there's no wonder that it feels punchy, and in fact that's more torque than the Triumph Rocket 3, which is currently said to produce the most torque of any production motorcycle, or well, internal combustion motorcycle I guess now. Now it's also a great handling bike, despite the fact that as with most electrics, it's pretty weighty at 247 kilograms curb. A lot of that is going to be from the battery, but even from just looking at it, you can see how low slung that weight is. And keep in mind that up where the fuel would normally be held, you've actually got a storage compartment, so there's really not much weight at all above the bone line there. Now you've got the same radially mounted brakes on 320mm discs as the SRF and SRS, which do a great job of stopping the bike, despite not being, you know, the fanciest name in the business. And it turns in nicely despite that 19-inch front. In fact, they specifically said that they didn't go for a fully off-road biased 21-inch front wheel because realistically most of the miles done on this bike are going to be on the road, and so the 19 gives the best balance of on and off-road performance. And And then you've got the suspension that works really nicely, so you get a 47mm fully adjustable Showa big piston separate function fork and a fully adjustable 46mm shock at the rear too. Despite that extra bit of travel, so 190mm compared to the 120 of the other two bikes in this lineup, it still feels composed and sharp. We took in plenty of twisty mountain roads over the side of Mount Etna, and it did it all easily at a good clip. Combined with that smoothness and torquiness that you get from an electric motor, it really is an enjoyable bike to ride on a good road. But perhaps the biggest plus for me of this bike was the comfort. That's one thing I didn't quite get on with the SRF and the SRS. They just sit a little bit too low. Take the seat height on the SRF, for example, at about 787mm, and this is meant to be a sporty naked bike. Compare that to the Speed Triple 1200 RS, for example, that sits at 830mm, the KTM Super Duke R at 835, the Ducati Street Fighter V4 at 845, and so of course you want a bike to be comfortable and easy to get on with, but if it's a little bit sporty in nature, you do want to be slightly up over the bars for that aggressive riding position. With the SRF, I just didn't get that feeling from it, and it felt a bit too squat at the back for me. The DSR-X though, I think it benefits from that little lift in the suspension and the bigger front wheel, and so now the seat's up at 828mm. It's still not huge for an adventure bike, it's actually lower than most, but it just gives it more of a substantial, proper big bike feel, and you're sat that little bit higher up for a more commanding riding position. Not that you're canted forward over the bars like a sports bike, the bars are wide and upright as you'd expect for an adventure bike, and so you can tour and cruise in comfort and also stand up for when you're off-road. On top of that, the seats are comfortable, the pegs are in a nice spot, the handguards work nicely in terms of keeping a bit of wind off your knuckles, the adjustable windscreen is decent, and then the big touring screen certainly looks pretty impressive, although we didn't get a chance to try it out. And then you've got the smoothness and quietness, and I could definitely spend a lot of time on this bike without any problems at all. Now a quick word on the off-road performance. We did do a bunch of trails around the base of Etna, so lots of lava dust and through some wooded areas, but we only had the cast wheel option with the standard Pirelli Scorpion Trail 2 tyres, so it's probably not fair to judge the bike on grippiness, especially on that sort of sandy surface. But what I can say is the standing position works quite nicely, the lowness of the weight also makes it feel pretty manageable, and then you've got off-road specific traction control and ABS settings, which you can apply to any of the 5 existing riding modes. Definitely helps, although I would say that the traction control still feels a bit keen on some of the climbs on those dusty trails, and it would have been nice to be able to switch it off to keep momentum when you're riding uphill. But if all you're doing is just light gravel trails and relatively easy stuff, then it definitely does the job, and it's a nice extra capability of this bike versus the other bikes in the lineup. Now look, so far I'm being pretty positive about this bike, but there are still 2 big issues when you set it against the internal combustion adventure bikes. Firstly, the range, and to be fair to it, it's pretty great in the city where you've got the benefits of lower speeds and the opportunity to regenerate when you're on the brakes. It's not too bad even with mixed riding and sort of back roads. But if you're looking for an adventure tourer that can smash out big miles on the motorway, then the range is really not so good. About 100 miles, give or take, and then you'll need to charge for at least an hour if you've got the rapid charging upgrade. That goes in the fuel tank storage compartment, so you'll lose the storage, or you can put a little bit more battery capacity in there instead of the rapid charging upgrade. But whichever way you configure it, you simply can't do those 200-mile stretches on a tank and then fill it up in a couple of minutes and then get straight out and do another 200 miles. Now Zero would probably say you need to change your mindset a little when it comes to touring on an electric motorcycle. You plan your routes more carefully, you take your time a bit more, you enjoy the journey rather than just smashing out the miles to get to the destination. But realistically, not everyone is going to want to do that, and personally, you know, I need a bike like my Tiger 800 that can get me from one side of the country to another, and I often need to be there at a specific time, so it'd be difficult for me to swap to something like the DSR-X right now. And then there's the price, which is £24,510 when it launches in early 2023. Now Zero did have this interesting slide in the press briefing where they showed the cost of ownership over time and how that compares to the big capacity adventure bikes that it might be competing with. If you hang on to it for long enough, it can even become cheaper to own than something like the Multistrada V4S Sport. But I do feel like they fairly carefully selected those competitors. Yes, in weight, it's more like a large capacity adventure bike, but really in performance, despite that torquey motor, it's more like a middleweight. 100 horsepower or so puts it in line with the Africa Twin, the KTM 890, the Triumph Tiger 900, the BMW F850. And that is kind of what it felt like on the road. It felt fast, but not like shit yourself fast like the Multistrada V4. These are like 18-gram bikes that they're comparing it to, but look at something like the KTM 890 Adventure. Absolutely awesome to ride, good at everything, and it starts at about 11.5 grand. So this chart isn't going to look quite as favorable if you paint that bike on. So with all that in mind, would I actually buy one of these over a petrol bike? Well, it really does depend on what sort of thing you like to do with your adventure motorcycle. Hands down, it makes the most sense for commuting. You've got a set distance that you cover each day, so there's no range anxiety. It's more efficient at commuting speeds anyway, and it's a comfy bike. It's quiet, it's clean, and it's still got plenty of fun when you do want to take it for a blast. Like I say, the handling is as good as anything else, and so if you're looking for something for weekend fun, then as long as you're not riding all day or you don't mind stopping for a bit to recharge, then it's all good for that sort of riding as well. Off-road, it's pretty good too, perhaps a little unconventional. You might miss the clutch and there's not as much clearance as some of the more off-road biased alternatives, but as a small part of what this bike can do, you know, it's perfectly good. But if you're looking for an adventure tourer that can do big distances, then I think I'd probably say you ought to look elsewhere at the moment. The range, the charging times, and when you combine those for how much mileage you can realistically do in a day, you know, it's just not there in comparison to petrol, at least for the time being. But you know, things are definitely heading in the right direction. I really enjoyed riding this bike. I'd say hands down it's my favorite electric motorcycle that I've ridden so far. It's fast, it's fun, it's good looking, it's versatile, it's comfortable. It ticks a lot of boxes, and so once the range and charging times are competitive with internal combustion bikes, it'd be the complete package. As always though, I'd love to know what you think of it down in the comments below, and if you're new here and you want to see more videos like this, hit subscribe and I'll catch you in the next one.